As fans of video games and people who long for insights into the industry, we often consider the budget of making games. How much it costs over how many years it takes. Destiny had an alleged $500 million budget, more than any other game or film. We look at these numbers in awe and occasionally confusion, but there's another kind of cost we often fail to consider. There's employment costs, there's marketing budgets, studio space, and lots of other kinds of expenses when it comes to making games, but what about the human cost? The toll that game development takes on a human being has been a topic in the industry for a long time now, but with more and more reports coming out about excessive unpaid overtime, workplace harassment, unrealistic deadlines, and other game dev issues, the time is now to ask the question, what can they do to prevent it? Or perhaps another question we should ask ourselves as consumers is, what can we do to help? Excessive unpaid overtime, or crunch, has been a part of the industry for as long as there have been deadlines that needed meeting, but it wasn't a widely known issue, at least outside of studios, until the mid and late 2000s. It wasn't a story broken by journalists or whistleblowers, but instead the significant others of developers working at EA and Rockstar. It was thanks to worried loved ones that this issue came to light, which kind of says it all. To put things in perspective, the average workday in America is about 9 hours long. During crunch time at certain studios, that can get to 14 hours long, 15 hours long, 16 hours long, for months at a time. What would normally be a 40 to 50 hour work week can turn into a nearly 90 or 100 hour work week for up to 9 months, or even longer. While working on Uncharted 4, Bruce Straley, the co-director on the project, actually rented out a second apartment closer to Naughty Dog's studio in order to get from home to work faster. Some CD Projekt Red developers reportedly stayed at their studio overnight to work on the game, even for seemingly simple things like refining the grass physics. It isn't just an American issue. Crunch is seen in studios internationally. Hideo Kojima even tweeted out that his studio was currently in crunch time for Death Stranding, so even the most seasoned developers across the world can't seem to avoid it. Something I hear outsiders to this issue claim is that if it's so bad, just go to another studio where it doesn't happen. This statement fails to realize two things. Almost every single studio crunches. 81% of developers say they've experienced crunch, and that due to the job market being so saturated with young, hungry, and talented developers, leaving could very well mean never returning. Crunch at some studios is considered optional, but optional in the sense that, yeah, you could choose not to do it and go home at your regularly mandated time of 6 or 7 p.m., you'll just be out of a job if you do. Or employees will feel the glaring judgment from colleagues and bosses, essentially guilting anyone who isn't crunching into sticking it out and staying at work until 3 a.m. for months on end, like everyone else. Kotaku reported that Rockstar's management, during the development of Grand Theft Auto 5, kept tabs on employees who were under or over their 60-hour workweek mandate. Anyone who found themselves in the under category was under constant risk of being let go or replaced, and that stress took a heavy toll on the mental health of Rockstar's employees. Other studios might have leaderboards for employees to tally up weekly hours. For some staff, it felt good to top that list, but for others, it was a reminder of the self-sustaining cycle of self-destruction based on taking advantage of the passion and guilt of game developers that was built right into a studio's culture. Burnout isn't the only reason why developers don't stay in the same place for too long. In fact, many studio employees are only employed for a year or less. What many studios do is, instead of delaying a project or changing the production calendar, they'll upsize significantly in an attempt to curb both crunch and a potential delay. Of course, this just results in even more people crunching when the time inevitably comes. And when the game finally launches, some of that staff will be retained to help develop future patches and content, but for the most part, all that extra staff, including some developers who are already at the studio, get laid off. Basically, a huge group of developers are finally given a major shot in the industry, are completely overworked for months, and then are subsequently laid off. If that sounds messed up, that's because it is. Game developers are often referred to as veterans after enough time in the industry. This isn't meant to make light of combat veterans or oversell their role in the industry. It's a legitimate gauntlet, one so intense it's actually rare for developers to work at the same studio for more than 5 years. The burnout is so intense, developers often report serious health issues that occur as a direct result of being overworked in front of a computer for months. During crunch, people gain weight, they get severe back issues, carpal tunnel, and other health concerns. Some developers have even reported coughing up blood or losing parts of their memory. Morale is also impacted heavily, leading some developers to feeling like the game will never come out. Working 60 to 100 hour work weeks for over 9 months in front of a computer would make anyone feel like they're stuck in a bottomless pit with no way out. Between crunch, harassment, and otherwise generally poor and unprofessional working conditions, it begs the question, how does this happen? With the rise of games as a service, crunch never ends for some developers, like those at Epic Games. It was a company mandate to have a new patch every week, but that obviously underestimates the amount of work required for adding and changing anything in a multiplayer game like that. New animations, polish, balancing, that can take a lot of time to refine. Even adding one simple new item can take a significant amount of time to make sure it meshes well and doesn't break the balance of the game. That weekly mandate is one of the reasons Respawn, the studio behind Fortnite's biggest competitor Apex Legends, specifically went out of their way to tell fans that balance patches and other content updates won't be as frequent as fans may expect in order to avoid employee burnout. Instead of doling out updates on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, Respawn specifically made it a point to take their time in order to avoid crunch, and something special happened after they let everyone know that. Pretty much everyone respected that decision. When developers and publishers are open and honest about why things may take longer than expected, people tend to respect that. They're willing to accept a wait if that means the developers are treated fairly and healthily. But lip service can only go so far in the eyes of developers and especially publishers. Crunch at Epic wouldn't happen if their data analytics didn't back up that weekly initiative. The fact of the matter is that, even though we as consumers appreciate it when developers don't need to crunch, we drop off of games we like if there aren't any changes being made, and publishers know that. We might come back every once in a while once they drop a new season or major content update, but publishers want to see consistent long-term engagement and growth. Publishers also don't want to see their game considered supplemental to other games. Obviously, they prefer it if people love their game more than any other game on the market and never stop playing it every day. Bungie tried structuring Destiny 2 around being something you didn't need to play every waking moment of your life, but it wasn't Activision that had a problem with it. Destiny 2's players didn't respond well to it. They felt that once you had done everything you needed to do that week, there was no reason to continue playing. Bungie later backpedaled on that idea with last year's Forsaken expansion. It seems as though crunch is an inevitability if gamers want their games to continue to grow and thrive. Or is it? Grinding Gear Games, the team behind free-to-play dungeon crawler Path of Exile, found a bit of a magic formula after experimenting for a while. They found that consistently releasing both large and small content updates every 13 weeks, or 3 months, was the sweet spot for keeping players engaged while also seeing long-term growth. One of their core mantras for this release schedule was, make sure that users quit with a plan to come back. They knew full well that there'd be a drop-off after a while, but giving players that safety net of, well, I know there'll at least be something new in this amount of time, is crucial for ensuring longevity. It's why Apex Legends lets people know in the game when the current season ends. If you aren't feeling it now, come back once this is over. So that's one way of solving it for games as a service. But for more traditional releases, crunch is almost unavoidable so long as there are deadlines. There's crunch for investor vertical slices, crunch for E3, crunch for alphas and betas, crunch for every single milestone in a game's development. When you really see how hard it is to make a video game, it almost feels like a miracle that anything gets made at all. Crunch is a product of something I call deadline culture, something mandated not by fans or consumers, but rather the publishers themselves. There are a ton of smaller deadlines throughout a game's development aside from the final release date, such as the milestones I mentioned before. And final release dates aren't settled on out of nowhere either. They're essentially catered around a game's budget and optimal release windows. A lot goes into deciding a date. Disc manufacturing, marketing campaigns, and more have to be in complete sync, centered around that date. Delaying a game isn't a simple task, and depending on how long the project has taken to make, it might be impossible to convince a publisher to push that date back. In Anthem's case, there were a variety of reasons it wasn't delayed further. It spent years in pre-production without proper direction, soaking up millions of dollars. And the reason it was settled in February was so it came out before EA's fiscal year ended. Basically, it was time to budget the next year's releases, and they wanted Anthem out in order to budget its post-launch content, and so the full game itself wasn't considered in their overall budget meetings. If a game comes out before it's obviously ready, it's either because A, something went terribly wrong during its development, B, the publisher wanted it out before the holidays, or C, they wanted it out before the fiscal year ends. Different companies have different fiscal years, so if a game feels like it's coming out at a weird time after a series of bad development stories, it's most likely due to their publisher's fiscal year. This isn't a defense of publishers by any means, but it's not as if publishers are coming up with these situations just to spite their employees. They're a business, and they're going to act under a clause called fiduciary duty. It's essentially the obligation of a company to make as much money as they can for the sake of its employees and facilities. If there's money on the table and no one is taking it, it makes investors feel as if that publisher isn't taking an opportunity to improve the business. That's why you see all these different kinds of nickel and diming throughout time. Paying for Xbox Live, online passes, microtransactions, season passes, now loot boxes, or surprise mechanics. These kinds of moneymakers wouldn't exist if they didn't work, which is why you see them shift and change to suit the time and environment, and why it's on us to not support situations that are obviously intended to be predatory. Again, I'm not defending it, it's just important to understand that a lot of the problems in the industry crop up because they work. And to be fair, companies like EA and Rockstar probably shouldn't be implementing monetization mechanics encouraged by rich whales in Saudi Arabia or Luxembourg, but you have to understand, and here's where it ties into crunch. They do what they do because it works. This is obviously no excuse for poor working conditions, ridiculous hours, and shady monetization techniques. But another reason why crunch happens is because companies see the intense passion of a select few developers who are willing to work until 2 a.m. every day for months on end, and then expect every employee to be capable of doing that exact same thing. When we see studios like Witcher 3 developer spends night at studio to fix the grass, we should be concerned and not celebratory of that behavior. Is the passion commendable? Absolutely. But does it set a healthy example for that developer's teammates? No. Publishers see that and think, well, if they can do it, everyone else can too. So, crunch really comes down to publishers underestimating how much work goes into certain ideas, budget constraints, passion that's taken advantage of, unmovable deadlines, and, most notably, it happens because it can and because it works. There has to be something that can be done about this, though. Even if there is something that can be done, what can normal people like you and me do about it? What can developers do to improve their working conditions, and what can we do as fans to support them? You've probably seen games journalists and personalities talk about it. We even saw another similar situation happen with voice actors, another key component of the video game industry. It's caused a lot of controversy, but many see it as the only option to improve working conditions in the industry. Of course, I'm talking about unionizing. Unions aren't just a thing of the past, nor are they necessarily reserved for hard labor jobs like factory work. There are dozens of unions in film, television, music, acting, journalism, so why can't video games be added to that list? Unions are how we have weekends. Unions are how we ended child labor. Unions are essential to ensuring the safety and longevity of a career in the video game development industry because producers will no longer be able to create production calendars that rely heavily on that studio's ability to crunch. It'll be based on their actual ability to do their jobs. Developers can go home at a reasonable time every evening, and if they want to stay later, they'd actually get paid overtime. Under a union, developers can be protected from certain behavior like sexual harassment, and from forced arbitration in the event they want to sue, hopefully leading to more accountability and action on a higher level. However, there's a catch. When the voice actors in the industry went on strike and joined unions, many studios opted to simply hire voice actors who weren't in a union. They were cheaper, could work longer hours, and in general didn't have the same protections as someone like Troy Baker or Laura Bailey, which is why some of those actors got replaced without even being offered a chance to perform. Unionizing in the gaming industry needs to be an all or nothing deal, or else even more young, talented developers are going to be taken advantage of, and even more industry veterans will be replaced for simply wanting better working conditions. There's also the topic of union fees that would have to be paid, but most workers in the industry would gladly pay them if it ensured a protected working environment. In order for unionization to ripple throughout the industry, someone big has to take the initiative. Someone who has always touted giving their developers the time and resources to make the games they want. Someone like PlayStation. PlayStation has already set the expectations for what makes for good game development by allowing their studios to make the projects they want and letting them push things back if need be. Look at God of War, Uncharted 4, Death Stranding. Xbox, Ubisoft, and other publishers certainly have. You don't get games like these by telling your developers exactly what to do and when to do it. The ripple effect PlayStation has had this generation with simply the quality of their games could be replicated with unionization. If PlayStation encouraged unionization and made it a point to hire unionized developers, what excuse would a publisher like EA or Bethesda have to not hire unionized developers? They'd of course have the option to hire who they choose, but seeing the reaction to Troy Baker and other actors being replaced in Borderlands 3, or Ashley Birch being replaced in Life is Strange, tells me that fans probably wouldn't take too kindly to PlayStation abandoning Neil Druckmann just because he's union. The industry is hanging on a precipice at the moment. The call to action has never been stronger for developers to unionize. At Riot Games, employees staged a walkout to protest their working conditions, and things have started changing for the better since then. At Rockstar, contract workers who spend enough time at the studio have started to become hired full-time after stories broke about them. Organizations like Game Workers Unite are working to unite developers across the world to form a union with a singular vision. It's happening. Someone just has to take the initiative. So, okay, that's all well and good, but what can we as fans do? Sometimes it feels like the industry is in this special sphere above all of us, and all we can do is sit around and accept what happens. What can we do to help? For starters, it can never hurt to be more understanding. Perhaps even with unions, crunch will still be a part of development culture, but studios would have to pay their workers overtime pay. With reduced crunch though, games will take longer to make. It goes without saying that working 40 to 50 hour work weeks instead of 90 or 100 will mean that things take a bit longer than they do now. What we can do to help is to understand that things take time, and that a game made by a team of healthy, balanced individuals paid a fair wage will probably be worth more in the end than one made by underpaid, overworked, and mentally distressed workers. We laud developers like Respawn who make it a point to avoid worker burnout, but we fall off of games that aren't getting new updates every week or two. We decry worker exploitation, but we celebrate stories about passionate developers who spend days overnight at the studio to make the trees look nicer. We want games made by healthy developers, but when you look at something like Red Dead Redemption 2, it's hard to deny that crunch works. We have to compromise somehow. You know what we can do to help? Make it clear that it's okay to wait longer for games. Don't turn a blind eye to poor working conditions. Don't get angry or harass developers on Twitter for game delays. Understand how hard it is to make games. Make it loud and clear that a game built off the suffering of developers isn't a game worth playing. And I'm not saying that you should never be upset or disappointed about anything that happens in the industry. And I'm not saying you should stop playing games you enjoy just because it comes with some caveats. I'm merely saying that our disappointment or anger should be pointed in the right direction. At the people who take advantage of developers, at the people who treat developers poorly, and at the people who treat video games like a money-making machine rather than the art form we know it is. But games take a lot of money and effort to make, and once we familiarize ourselves with the creative process, we can start to appreciate every part of gaming a lot more. Thank you for watching. If you want to read up more on the subject of game development, I'm going to include a ton of links in the description to all the stories I covered in this video. I also recommend watching some GDC talks, some of which I'll also include, and reading the book Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Kotaku writer Jason Schreier. There are a ton of absolutely insane stories in that book. So if you want to read more about some of the stories I mentioned, like the ones about Uncharted 4 and The Witcher 3, that's where you should look. There's also an episode of Patriot Act on Netflix that covers a lot of this stuff too, so I definitely recommend checking that out if you have a subscription. Links to my social media and Patreon are down below, and as always, I'll see you next time.